Citizens Conversation with Maajid Nawaz.
Good afternoon, it's Maajid Nawaz here on LBC, sitting in for Sheila Fogarty all week. Now, Nadhim Zahawi, the Vaccines Minister, has said that vaccine passports for large venues and mass gatherings in the UK will be mandated. And then he said to avoid another national lockdown. Now, this kind of language makes me feel very, very uncomfortable, and I feel like the public is being threatened by the government that if you don't do what we say, we'll lock you down again. And unfortunately, when you consider the history of this government's performance around curtailing our civil liberties under the guise of meeting the emergency that is the pandemic, it doesn't leave much room for trust and faith in their direction of travel. And it's the direction of travel that I'd like everybody to focus on. Because if you take your minds back 18 or so months ago, where this all began, and it was initially just a short circuit breaker lockdown to control the spread. From there, of course, it became, we just need to lock down to protect the NHS. And from there, it became, we just need to keep the lockdown in place until all the vulnerable are jabbed because, hey, look, we now have this amazing vaccine. And the public, myself included, when they gave us the milestones and the roadmap through lockdown, were willing to say, okay, you know what, many of us never agreed with you in the first place, but we're willing to let you go through these motions so that you prove to us that you will not continue shifting the goalposts and continue on mission creep, grabbing more and more power under the name of this emergency. So it went from protecting the NHS to let's just jab the vulnerable. But then it didn't stop there. Then they said we need to jab all the over 40s. Just bear with us. And again, we said, okay, we're going to go through this roadmap until all the over 40s are jabbed. And that included myself. And then if you remember, when it was meant to be the day that lockdown ended, they extended it yet again. They extended the lockdown and people felt, you know what, is this never going to end? And their whole idea was we just need a few more people jabbed, all the over 30s. And then it became all the over 20s. Just bear with us. All the over 20s need to be jabbed. And then you got to a point where after they had told us that children would not need to be jabbed, the JCVI, if you remember, U-turned and decided that 16-year-olds would be offered the jab, but certainly not people that are 12. And then it moved, of course, despite the JCVI now failing to recommend publicly that 12-year-olds should be jabbed. Now we're hearing that the government wants to go ahead and do it anyway. So the direction of travel is what I'd like you to focus on for a moment, because what I'd like to do for this hour is keep in mind that retrospective. We, having all lived through it, we all know how the goalposts kept shifting because we lived through it. I don't think I need to dwell too much on that. But what's happening now is that the goalposts have shifted so much that the government ministers appear to have even forgotten what they pledged to us absolutely that they would not do, such as introduce mandated domestic vaccine passports. So what I'd like to do is, having reminded you of that direction of travel and how the goalposts kept shifting, let's look to where we are now, where having promised us that they wouldn't implement mandated domestic vaccine passports, that they wouldn't turn us into a papers, please society, that now they want to even do that. And then what I'd like to do after playing you a couple of clips there where they promised us that they wouldn't do any such thing is then just let you know what's going on in Australia. Because the direction of travel point, the concern many of us from a civil liberties perspective have is that it doesn't stop. And if it doesn't stop, we end up where Australia is, which I'll bring a bit more detail for you in just a moment. But have a listen to Vaccines Minister Nadhim Zahawi explaining his U-turn here on LBC with my colleague Tom Sawbrick on Sunday.
We learnt a lot about how this virus behaves, how infectious the Delta variant is. No one in this government, not this Prime Minister, it's not in his DNA to want to curtail people's freedoms. But what we know now, and that is the big differentiator, is in large-scale gatherings, especially indoors, the virus will spread.
It's not in Boris Johnson's DNA to curtail people's freedoms, and yet here he is curtailing people's freedoms, which by definition means that it is in his DNA. And that was Vaccines Minister Nadhim Zahawi explaining why they want to introduce mandated domestic vaccine passports. But the funny thing is, one wonders that all the assurances and promises he gave that they'd never do this, he used the word that these would be discriminatory and that this is not how the UK does things. What has changed? Here he is, just 6 months ago, on the very same topic.
No, we're not. And there are several reasons why we're not doing that. One, vaccines are not mandated in this country, as Boris Johnson's quite rightly reminded Parliament. That's not how we do things in the UK. We do them by consent. We yet don't know what the impact of vaccines on transmission is, and it would be discriminatory. Of course, you have the evidence that you've been vaccinated held by your GP, and if other countries require you to show proof of that evidence, then that is obviously up to those countries. But we've vaccinated, or we've given the first dose to 11.5 million people, and we have no plan of introducing a vaccine passport.
Now, he used the word discriminatory. Of course, I often mention on my own regular show on the weekends that Article 6 of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights makes it absolutely clear that consent, informed consent, is a fundamental pillar of any medical procedure. The text of that article is any preventative, diagnostic and therapeutic medical intervention is only to be carried out with the prior free and informed consent of the person concerned, based on adequate information. The consent should, where appropriate, be express and may be withdrawn by the person concerned at any time and for any reason without disadvantage or prejudice. That's what consent means in medical ethics terms. That's what it means in international human rights standards, as according to the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, Article 6. Now, to say, therefore, that it would be discriminatory to impose mandated vaccines on people for access to services would be correct. So what changed in the Vaccines Minister Nadhim Zahawi saying that 6 months ago to now believing that it's the right thing to do? Well, in the clip you just heard, he said, we yet don't know the impact of vaccines on transmission. 6 months ago, we did not know the impact of vaccines on transmission. He was correct. Today, we do know the impact of vaccines on transmission, because multiple studies have now been done on it. The largest, most reliable of was the most recent one from Oxford that was done, which, as published by Reuters on August the 19th, this month, unequivocally explains the impact of vaccines on transmission. And unfortunately for the government, it's not what they wanted. I'm going to read for you directly from this Reuters piece from the 19th of August 2021 on the very question that you just heard Nadhim Zahawi say. We don't want to introduce vaccine passports because we don't know their impact on transmission. He said that 6 months ago, yet today he wants to introduce them. Well, this is their impact on transmission. Direct quote for you. Underscores concerns by scientists that the Delta variant, first identified in India, can infect fully vaccinated people at a greater rate than previous lineages, and here's the key part, and that the vaccinated could more easily transmit it. That's the latest science on the Delta variant and the waning efficacy of being double jabbed against the Delta variant. And to summarise the latest science, and all of this is in the Oxford research and the research that's come from Israel, the latest, most up-to-date research on how Delta behaves with the vaccine, right? And the conclusions from the latest research are the following: that the vaccine does reduce symptoms if you're infected. That part is pretty much clear. Most people understand that the vaccine reduces symptoms for those that get infected. But the latest data indicate that you're more likely to get infected if you're double jabbed with a Delta variant. So though it reduces symptoms if you get it, you're more likely to get it by being double jabbed. That's what the data is indicating coming from Israel. Now, in addition to being more likely to actually become infected with having the double jab, you also carry a similar viral load to the unvaccinated and could transmit COVID more easily than those who've recovered naturally from a previous infection. That's what the data is telling us. It does not only fail to stop transmission, the vaccines, but you could be more likely to transmit it if you're double jabbed. So if you hear this, and this is all based, as I say, on the latest evidence, the Oxford study and the data coming from Israel, all of which are published, for example, by Reuters on August the 19th and other sources, I've put them all on my social feeds. If you understand that the vaccine does not stop transmission, then any mandated domestic vaccine passport is illogical, is unscientific, because in fact you're more likely to transmit it with having 2 jabs with the Delta variant. So it's illogical, unscientific, and also discriminatory, which even the vaccines minister admitted to 6 months ago. So why on earth, if the logic doesn't stand up, the whole idea you want to introduce a mandated domestic vaccine passport is because you want to stop transmission when you know that the vaccine doesn't stop transmission. So the logic doesn't stand up, the science isn't behind you, and you already know that it's discriminatory and violates Article 6 of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics. Why the U-turn? Why do you want to implement it? And this brings me back to the direction of travel and the shifting goalposts. The fact is, what we already know is that the government has been engaging from the beginning of this pandemic in a psychological operation with the public. It's called nudging, psychological nudging, bit by bit, giving us pieces of information that they intend to do so they can nudge us towards an end conclusion. And the only question then that remains is that what is the end conclusion of this nudging? Where would they like us to go? Well, if the science doesn't support and the logic and the human rights basis does not support a mandated domestic vaccine passport, why would you want to introduce it? Realistically, that there is only one conclusion I can come to, and that is that there's a conflict of interest here. You're seeking, for some reason or the other, to implement something against all reason, against all science, as the latest data indicates. There must be some ulterior motive here. Perhaps people are conflicted in their interest. Perhaps big pharma, perhaps big tech companies, all of whom stand to profit and gain from mandated domestic vaccine passports. Perhaps their lobby is more powerful than we previously imagined and has influenced politicians who we know through the revolving door are coveting board positions and appointments after they leave political life. And perhaps that can explain the motive for trying to implement something that makes absolutely no sense. And the direction of travel, I'd like to stay on for a second, because, folks, if we don't draw a line here, if we don't say this is our red line, you've gone far enough already. The ONS tells us that 9 out of 10 adults in the entire country, in all of the UK, have antibodies to COVID. And we know that the double jab does not stop transmission of COVID. In fact, it makes you more likely, perhaps, to transmit it. If we know all of this, and yet we know that natural immunity after recovery from COVID is stronger and more wide-ranging than immunity from the vaccine, and yet you still want to implement this vaccine passport, then it's about conflicts of interest and controlling the public. And where does this line head? And I would ask all of you then to look to Australia and see where Australia has ended up, because Australia is ultimately where we could end up if we continue down this path when I talk about the direction of travel. And it's why, inch by inch, as we move closer to that direction, each step we take may feel innocuous. It may feel, it's just another tiny thing we have to do for the common good. Before you realise it, every inch you've given that makes internal logical sense, it's just another thing we have to do for the common good. Before you realise it, you've given an inch and they've taken a mile. And that's why I'd like to point you all to Australia, because Australia now as a country locks down entire states, even if one COVID case has appeared. Australia as a country is now on the record, on video, using rubber bullets to shoot at their own citizens who've been protesting against some of this. On August the 22nd, Australia, as Australian News reported, because they had such a strict lockdown, and this was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald, because they had such a strict lockdown, they didn't want people travelling to collect rescue dogs from a shelter. So they decided, these were healthy dogs with no hint whatsoever that they had any form of illness or COVID or anything. They decided to shoot these dogs instead of having people travel to collect them from the rescue shelter. That's where Australia's got to. In other words, you're telling me you'd rather travel to shoot animals than have people travel to rescue them in the name of public health. Think about that. They'd rather travel to shoot animals after having already used rubber bullets on their population than have people travel to collect and rescue these animals. So that was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald on August the 22nd, but it didn't stop there, folks. It did not stop there. On the 23rd, Australian News reported, as according to 9 News in Adelaide, Australia reported that now they are imposing COVID quarantine signs on people's front doors. In other words, you put a big fat sticker on someone's front door, dangerous, do not enter, this person is quarantining. Can you see where this is headed? And it didn't stop there. Then we have something even worse, and that is that they passed a law called the Surveillance Legislation Amendment, Identify and Disrupt Bill 2020, which allows the government now in Australia, as passed on the 31st of August, allows them to do three things with your own phone and your own data. Number one, modify or delete the data of a suspect. A suspect, not even a convict. No, just a suspect. They can go into your data, go into your phone and modify or delete it. Number two, collect intelligence on criminal networks. But keep in mind, these are suspects, yeah? Number three, this is a weird one. Take control of suspected offenders' online accounts. They could take control of your Facebook account without your permission and begin to run it. Right? Keep in mind, we're talking about a context where everyone's locked in their homes. People are quarantined. Protest is banned. They're shooting animals and rubber bullets are being used. Now you've got this particular piece of legislation that allows them to go into your online accounts and control them. It doesn't stop there. Now they have also set up large quarantine camps that, if you see the aerial view of, remind you and are reminiscent, eerily so, of the camps that China set up for the Uyghurs, who also, they said, was for the purpose of health and public education. Have a listen to the Premier of Queensland talking about this quarantine facility.
Best way to keep you safe and to keep Delta out of Queensland is to build as quickly as possible a regional quarantine facility. I have listened to Queenslanders. I know how much they support a regional quarantine facility to be in Queensland. They want their community kept safe. That's what they're saying to me, and we are delivering it.
Nice music in the background there, right? It doesn't stop there with the camps. Australia has then moved forward as well. As the Atlantic magazine reported, direct quote, the people in South Australia will be forced to download an app that combines facial recognition and geolocation. The state will text them at random times, and thereafter they will have 15 minutes to take a picture of their face in the location where they are supposed to be. Should they fail, the local police department will be sent to follow up in person. 15 minutes to respond to the government confirming where you are with your facial recognition and geolocation. Otherwise, they send the police on you. That's as reported by the Atlantic magazine, again, about Australia. And folks, it doesn't stop there. Have a listen to the Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, talking about denying even healthcare to those who are unvaccinated.
To protect the health system, we've got everybody locked down. We're going to move to a situation where, to protect the health system, we're going to lock out people who are not vaccinated and can be. If you're making the choice not to get vaccinated, then you're making the wrong choice.
Is this not an incredibly dangerous direction of travel? And that's my point. We know where we began. We know how they kept shifting the goalposts through nudge theory. We know how many promises they've broken, telling us they wouldn't do things that they now want to do. Look to Australia to worry about where we could end up. And that is the question I'm asking you. The jab doesn't stop transmission. So what explains our government's desperation to mandate domestic vaccine passports? You're listening to Maajid Nawaz here on LBC, and the time is 2:20.
LBC.
When you own a